Joining us is Alexei Levchenko, a Russian journalist. Hello, Alexei.
Good.
Yes, good morning. Good morning.
I see there is literally a month left until the State Duma elections. By this time, has anything changed regarding the mobilization process, or does it remain partial as before? In Putin's decision, perhaps something can be observed somewhere. And actually, what is the mood of the citizens? Are they ready to fight indefinitely?
Yes, but it's obvious that a month before the State Duma elections, we definitely can't say whether such a decision will be made, but the citizens are both expecting it and fearing it. There are a whole range of categories who have already started, preparing and are planning to either leave in mid-September for a period of up to a month, or some have already left, right? So, indeed, psychologically, many are preparing for this. Although, regardless, if such a decision were suddenly made, it would, of course, in any case, be shocking, sudden, and abrupt. Unless it's a one-time decision, right? And not the situation you were just discussing in the segment, where it could be a covert, hybrid mobilization where just a few tens of thousands are called up per month, but it won't be as noticeable.
Uh-huh. Alexei, and these few tens of thousands, is there actually anywhere to get them from? After all, people surely wouldn't want to go to war, and then, consequently, end up in a nice black bag, whether it's through mobilization or a contract. Because the reluctance is probably the same, isn't it? Or is it easier to resolve the issue with contract soldiers, so to speak? Some people have debts, and so they'll be forced. Others have some other problems, and accordingly, the state machine, so to speak, will resolve this issue.
Yes, indeed. Every region compiles lists of such troubled individuals, and accordingly, recruiters and military enlistment offices work with them, and law enforcement agencies work with them as well. For example, they threaten them with criminal cases to force them to sign a contract. But one must understand that in this category, there are also people who still don't want to serve, who may be antisocial, but they are antisocial, including towards the state. And accordingly, they don't want to go to any wars to defend this state. Therefore, in this category, there is still some visible resource that can be tapped into. But after that, problems will begin, because then they will have to recruit or mobilize people who are more economically active, who are more involved in public life, and who absolutely do not want to end up on the front lines. They go to work, they support their families, and it's clear that this is where problems could start, even if it's just mobilization in small waves.
As for protest sentiment, well, actually, it's often expressed through support for one political force or another. There aren't many of them in Russia, of course, but nevertheless, they position themselves against the war or for ending it, for peace, no matter how broad that might sound. But nevertheless, just now, the deputy chairman of the Yabloko party, Lev Schlossberg, was sentenced to 11 years in a penal colony. The decision was handed down by the Peskov City Court. The politician was found guilty of allegedly discrediting the army and spreading fakes about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the reason for opening the case was Schlossberg's repost on his Telegram channel of an Echo of Moscow publication featuring the cover of the British newspaper Daily Mirror. It depicted a bloodied woman and the Russian dictator Putin. The caption below read, "Her blood, his hands." Furthermore, Schlossberg has repeatedly spoken out about the need for an immediate end to Russia's war against Ukraine. As you see, why wasn't it enough to just remove this political party from the election race? And how do you assess the reaction that followed this event, the removal of the party from the election race? And what about now? To what extent might protest sentiment increase, or not, because Schlossberg was sentenced to 11 years?
Yes, indeed. We see that there are certain categories of people whom the authorities are dealing with particularly harshly. One of these categories is those certain deputies at the regional or municipal levels, like Schlossberg himself or Alexei Goranov in Moscow, who are receiving very harsh, long sentences. And this is the result of the fact that, despite the fact that they initially represented an opposition force, the authorities are dealing particularly harshly with those who held some positions within the government, even if it was representative. It is, in a way, a cautionary tale, yes, including for those who are inside the government on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's clear that the sentences being handed down in recent years and months are indeed trending upward. It's like an analog in 1937, where people aren't being executed now, but in essence, they are being deprived of their lives for several decades, say 10 or 20 years. We know of examples where people are given as much as 23 years, like Karamurza. He was, however, later exchanged. But one way or another, these are truly draconian sentences. And as for the Yabloko party, it's true that the moment it was registered and the moment it was removed turned out to be extremely short, right? It was just a few days. And during those few days, there were serious signs that a serious, a sharp rise in the rating had begun. It's clear that this rise in the rating was connected not so much to the Yabloko party itself, but to the fact that in reality, the demand for expressing a real opinion, for expressing an anti-war position, is actually quite high in society, and the authorities were simply scared by the situation.
Alexei, well, actually, speaking of the fact that the authorities and Putin personally are afraid, that has, in my opinion, become completely obvious, right? Russians were fed for so long with this dish called Putin is our strongest and toughest leader. But lately, it's becoming clear that this dish is starting to smell a bit off, and frankly, it probably needs to be thrown out. But what's interesting is that you and I also talked in our last conversation about this tour of Putin's to a number of cities and regions. So strictly speaking, this visit, these Putin tours, they have already concluded. How do you think, did he actually achieve these strictly speaking goals? Well, it's clear that the goals were also, among other things, related to the election. Well, and you had to try to shake off that bitter aftertaste related to economic problems, to that same fuel crisis, to that same fear of mobilization, and to convince Russians once again that in reality, they want to fight. It's obvious that's what he was talking about when he said that Russians actually have this genetic code of a winner. And actually, he continued to explain that Russia and, strictly speaking, Putin himself intend to continue the war at the very least until 2028. In particular, Kovalenko, the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, wrote about this the other day, noting that all parties in the so-called elections in the Russian Federation now stand exclusively for the continuation of the war. And the only anti-war party, Yabloko, which is what we were just talking about, right? They were removed from the elections, and that's it. That issue's closed. And at the same time, the dictator Putin and his inner circle are exclusively profiting from the war. Let's listen to the direct speech for our viewers and discuss it.
It is important to understand that there are economists in Russia who have access to Putin and are against pulling able-bodied men out of the economy and killing them in the war. However, the military, intelligence, some of the oligarchs profiting from the war, Kiriyenko and Putin himself, unfortunately want to continue the war. Andrea Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the NSDC of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Well, there's a whole complex of questions here right away. Does Putin really manage to achieve anything with these exhortations of his to the Russians? And strictly speaking, these two polar points of view in his inner circle. Can any of them in the current situation claim victory for themselves, so to speak? Let's call it that.
Yes, the discussion around whether it is necessary to continue mobilizing the economy or if it is time to stop the war, it is, of course, breaking through, obviously. We were discussing a while ago the statement by Sobyanin, who said that under no circumstances should we switch to a war footing, that it would kill everything, right? At the end of last week, everyone was discussing the report by Andrei Klepak, the now former economist of Nesh Economic Bank and former deputy minister of economy, who said that Russia cannot win a war of attrition against the West in the economic sphere, and that it is losing it, and that it will all end in a social catastrophe. Yes, indeed, such a discussion exists. We understand that, on one hand, to some extent, Putin is also listening to it, because there isn't a war economy per se, but at the same time, I mean, yes, a total military economic mobilization isn't happening where all factories are working for the war effort. But at the same time, the increase in war spending is indeed not stopping. It's becoming increasingly threatening. And this situation has a tendency to worsen.
Alexei, regarding how great Putin's own fears for his life are right now, what in fact has changed? Perhaps in his inner circle, his security? What kind of attempts, perhaps, are coming from those who do not want the war to continue? Because plans are already being made for this so-called special military operation to go into its 27th year. How do you assess this?
Well, those fears haven't gone anywhere. They have existed since the very beginning of the war, yes. And in fact, even before the war started, Putin was characterized by quite serious paranoid fears. Maybe not even paranoid, because it's clear that it's difficult for him to fully trust his own inner circle. Well, now we see a visible manifestation of these fears in the fact that, indeed, on one hand, Putin has started traveling around Russia because for the first 6 months he didn't travel at all, and there were literally only a few trips. Now he has started traveling, but he travels exclusively in zones where the probability of drones or even missiles reaching him is still minimal. Yeah, that is, all the trips took place around the Far East in Siberia. And it's clear that this is a kind of pre-election tour, a pre-election campaign trail, because in September, on September 20th, the State Duma elections will take place. And there is a tradition that all officials, led by the president, travel around the country during this period to different regions and conduct some kind of active public engagement there. Well, this time, this public engagement turned out to be quite significantly limited geographically. This is a visible manifestation, yes, of concerns.
Alexei, well, you very subtly noted, for now, they are unreachable. This is a temporary phenomenon. I think that the Ukrainian defense forces are working in this direction, and there will be success. But let's talk about the Russians who, strictly speaking, are hosting these dear guests. Well, for example, take Novosibirsk, just as a specific example, right? They were repairing roads, cleaning everything up, tidying, preparing for the arrival of the main person. And what about the Russians, actually? Well, the Russians were told to stay home, not to go near the windows, and not to use phones or other electronic means of communication. I mean, just don't be visible at all. Play dead, just so that, God forbid, you don't actually scare dictator Putin. Did people just swallow that? What are they saying? Maybe.
Yeah, well, actually, this isn't the first visit like this. In principle, there is a certain system for preparing such visits, where usually, by the way, they are prepared. Now. This lag has shortened so that they don't know in advance where Putin is going to arrive. Usually, a large team arrives about 2 weeks in advance. They start patching everything up there. All sorts of funny footage often appears, like manhole covers, sewer ones, being paved over with asphalt. That's actually also, yeah, because for security reasons, so that no one crawls out of those manholes. Yeah, so this whole thing, it's in principle been roughly the same for many years. Yes, indeed. The security measures are things like don't go near the windows, turn off mobile service, and so on. In general, you could say that people have gotten used to it.
Thanks, Al. It's quite a situation. I suppose people get used to anything. Alexei, thank you so much for finding the time to join our live broadcast today. Alexei Levchenko, a Russian journalist, was a guest on the live broadcast on the Freedom TV channel.